With the latest agriculture news from across the state and nation, it's time for the AgNet News Hour from AgNet West. Here's your host, Sabrina Halvorson.
Good morning. Thanks for joining us this morning on the AgNet News Hour. I am Sabrina Halvorson here with Lorrie Boyer. Morning, Lorrie.
Good morning to you.
So this morning, sometimes Lorrie and I, before the show starts and we're talking about what are we going to talk about today, sometimes it's hard, but today we're like, oh my gosh, there's so many things to talk about. Let's find what we're going to do here. So what we've narrowed it down to, we're going to start out talking about a group of farmers who are suing the USDA, and it's over the agency deleting the climate change data. This is important data. First off, when you think about climate change, what industry is it going to affect the most? I would dare to say agriculture, because we're talking about things like our weather and droughts and climate related policies and things. These are things that absolutely affect our agriculture and our farmers around the United States. So the Trump administration, President Trump himself and Musk, decided a couple of weeks ago that the federal government needed to erase all of its data on climate change and climate science. And so they went through, the USDA, following orders, went through and scrubbed all of its data relating to climate change from websites and from its network. This, of course, is going to have some major negative effects on farmers around the nation. So a group of farmers has filed a lawsuit this week in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York to try to get access once again to this climate information. And this is information that scientists have been studying for decades, looking at how the shifts in the climate do affect our farming and our agriculture. Now, this information that our farmers use to make decisions, they use it for applying for different programs. They use it just to know what to expect in the future, things like that. So many decisions made on this data. This data has now been erased by the Trump administration.
And I'm glad that we are talking about this because it's made some national news headlines, obviously, but it also has flown under the radar because USDA did not give any public notice, did not issue any press releases to us that I got anyway. No, I didn't see any information on them doing this, even on their own social media pages and such. They just literally took this down. And the reasoning behind it, from what I can tell anyway, and it's such a short sentence, if you will, just a short explanation. And that is because, as we've been talking about, President Donald Trump and the administration is reversing a lot of the things that the Biden administration did, and that includes climate policies. And so I think, if I'm reading correctly, the reason that they did take it down is part of that effort to reverse climate policies. But I think that one of the arguments in this lawsuit, and a valid argument at that, is that taxpayers paid for the studies that you refer to. These are longer term studies. Even in the first the first Trump administration, some of this was already going on. It just got more aggressive with Biden coming in and his climate change policies and his climate change notions that he was working towards. But we are talking about climate change policies that were instituted and paid for taxpayer dollars to put these studies together, to put tools together, to put data sets together that farmers need now in order to make those decisions. And a lot of these weather-related tools that were on there are important to farmers, whether it's termed climate change or not.
That is such an important point. What we're talking about, first off, it is not going to save any money by erasing this information. We're talking about, as you pointed out, studies that have already been done, money that's already been spent by taxpayers on these studies because the taxpayers deemed it to be important. This money was spent already years ago, even before the Biden administration, and continuing studying things that we should be looking into, like why is the earth changing and how is that going to affect agriculture, and how do we make our agricultural practices more efficient with these changes that are happening, whether we like them or not. So it's not a money-saving effort. It's actually it's going to waste money because now that all of those studies and things, we don't have ready access to them anymore. So how are we going to get that information again. We still need that information, but now the government's withholding it. So, what do you do if you're a farmer who has to make decisions that are going to affect your farm over the next 10 years? And maybe you need to know what's the outlook for drought in your area, let's say. That's a very important one in California. Things like that. How can you even make that decisions when the USDA is saying, "Oh, no, we're not going to give you that information anymore."
And one could argue that some of the data and the programs and the tools that were put together under the Inflation Reduction Act funding could be removed. That would not surprise me because President Trump is pretty much doing away with things that were created under the IRA.
Mhm.
However, a lot of these data sets, weather patterns, and tools that have been created were before the IRA. So those should not, I don't think, should not have been taken down. And not only that, but this is public tools. Be public, the taxpayers, US Americans paid for that. So I guess this is part of the lawsuit, if you will, is that why does USDA have the authority to take what we paid for, the things that we own on this, the information that we own as a public, just take it off there without even letting the public know? To me, that doesn't seem real fair. And here's another point, I think, is when we talked about how we froze the grants into different programs. Why did we not just freeze any further work on putting data sets together and tools and
Right.
enhancing all these things on the website? Why did we not just freeze it? Why did we just go in and wipe it out?
That's a great question. Why did we have to eliminate all of the work that's already been done? I understand if you say, hey, this is not worth pursuing in the future, that's fine. But why did we have to say it's not worth pursuing in the future and we don't like that we did it in the past, so let's delete it all? That that makes
Exactly.
no sense. We're going to keep talking about this. We'll look a little bit more into the lawsuit as well, but we're talking this morning about the USDA eliminating data on climate science and not allowing that data to go out to farmers anymore. There is a lawsuit now that has been filed by farmers and also by environmental groups. I do want to make a point of pointing out that environmental groups are involved in this. And while you and I, Lorrie, on the show try to remain apolitical, it may sometimes sound like we're not because we are pointing out flaws in the administration, but we are just as happy to point out flaws in the other administration as well, but which I see as being balanced. However, I do want to point out that there is quite possibly for some of these environmental groups, there could be a more political motivation. I think it's fair for us to point that out that there has always been a political divide between a lot of environmental groups and the more conservative side of our politicians and things like that. So that's worth noting. However, when it comes to farmers, this action is detrimental to our farmers and our U.S. agriculture, which is why it's important to be talking about.
A couple of other things I've seen on here that are interesting is that the USDA Director of Digital Communications was sent an email from the Trump administration higher ups telling them to identify an archive. This is from MSN.com, by the way. Identify an archive or unpublish any landing pages focused on climate change no later than close of business by Friday, January 31st. So we're almost just a few days shy of one full month of that. And it's just now coming out. People are just
Yeah.
now realizing, oh, hey, this information is gone. So why wasn't the announcements that they were going to take this information off? First off, as I mentioned earlier, we weren't given a warning. And then after it was done, it was nothing. It's like chirping. So that doesn't seem fair to me either. As
Yeah.
we dive into this a little bit more and people are wondering, what data sets, what are they talking about? Weather information is a big deal, but just to give folks a couple of other ideas of information that was wiped out and that was on there, especially here in California, you and I have talked several times about different things that were wiped out. So flooding, fires, emergency preparations, and things like that, soil sinking, topsoil, erosion, cropland, irrigation, all that kind of information and data was on there, not only for specific areas, but also for geographical areas. That helps farmers make decisions on what they're going to buy as far as inputs, their farming strategies, the equipment they use, the kind of crop insurance that they want and need, as well as what FSA programs, Farm Service Agency programs to utilize. It's also important, I think, to point out that this information was a huge foundation as you and I talked about, certifying organic crops and organic farms. Now, while I don't know exactly all the details on that aspect, you and I just talked about organics and the importance and the growing consumers that are buying organics. This is a big deal.
Yes, you're absolutely right. The organic market continues to grow, to get even bigger, and is with younger buyers. And I say younger, I say this as a woman who's turning 50 in a couple of months. Younger being like 30s, grown-ups. We're not talking about little kids, but they are much more interested in buying organics, and so that's an important market, and especially for our California farmers. We have a lot of fantastic organic growers in California who grow organic produce for the whole nation. And there's so much precision involved in organics. And I don't mean like precision ag, that too, but you have to have your data to be able to make your farming decisions. And the fact that the USDA is withholding, the United States Department of Agriculture is withholding important agricultural related information from farmers. That makes no sense, especially here in the United States.
I think it goes back to our discussion as well when we talked about how the administration fired a bunch of researchers and people that were
Yes.
actively involved in disease research and mitigation, specifically talking about the bird flu and HPAI. They got a little carried away, got a little fire happy, and they fired a bunch of people that shouldn't have been fired and have rehired a lot of those folks since. But it was done in error, but it was also done very quickly, as you and I talked about. I'm thinking that this might be another case of that because anything titled climate change, they didn't look. The officials did not go through and look and say, oh, there's a lot of research that goes back way beyond the Biden administration. Maybe we need to look into seeing here and weeding through this a little bit more in depth on what should stay on here. But instead, they probably, I am totally assuming here, folks, totally, they did a keyword research for anything climate change, and anything that popped up, it's gone.
That's at
Yeah.
least that's
That's
how
what
it
it feels like.
appears. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right on track with that. That's exactly what it looks like. They did a control F for find, and anything that said climate change or climate smart, hit the delete button. We are talking this morning about, it started out, we're talking about a lawsuit that has been filed by farmers against the USDA because the USDA, following orders from President Trump and Musk, whatever his title is, all of the climate change data that the USDA has. Now, this is important data. And you made a point, Lori, just before the break that perhaps they did not research how far back some of this data went. We know that the Trump administration is trying to reverse just about everything that the Biden administration did. And that's par for the course when it comes to presidential administrations. You undo what the other side did. But what they did not consider, or at least it looks like they didn't consider because they still deleted everything, climate change data goes back for decades. I remember learning about climate change research back in the 80s because I'm that old. And also because my dad was a scientist or really into, I come from a family that's very much into science. My grandfather worked for NASA. We value science in my family, and that was one of the things I learned about in the 80s was how the earth was changing. At that time, we were calling it global warming, I think, but we've learned better, and now it's climate change. And that's part of the data that has just been eliminated by USDA. But that historical data is very important in finding what future trends are going to be. That's the way that science works. And deleting the science doesn't mean that it just no longer exists. It just means that we're now ignorant to it.
Yeah, and not to mention, like before the break, that this information is used for programs, for USDA's own programs. So
Right.
again, I think taking a fine-tooth comb and looking through things and deciding that where we should and shouldn't be spend money is a good idea. But this just feels, I mentioned before the break, like it was done very hastily, not really a lot of thought process put into it. And maybe there's administration officials who don't even realize the importance of value of this and might have to bring it back because we use it for crop insurance and for the other FSA programs, as I pointed out. And not to mention that taxpayer dollars paid for it and they own it. So to me, that's just a whole nother thing. So I'm glad that people are noticing and bringing this lawsuit forward to at least, if nothing else, bring awareness to what's going on and some of this important things that are really needed for the industry. And that maybe when it comes to at least to the USDA and the ag industry here in the United States, that those Trump administration officials making the decisions will put a little bit more thought into these processes, because if it does directly affect the food that those administration officials are eating, the clothes that they are wearing, the shoes that they are wandering around in, all of this affects them directly.
It does, whether they realize it or not. Even the lawmakers who don't come from ag areas, we have spent a lot of time, Lori, I know both of us, talking like when we go to Washington, once a year, our professional organization, the National Association of Farm Broadcasting, has an event where we go to Washington, D.C., and we meet with a lot of lawmakers and interview them on ag topics, and they speak with us and things. And we always make it a point to have a few who are not from ag areas. Now, admittedly, most of them that the NAFB sets up for us are from ag areas because those are important for us to talk to. They're from our areas. But once in a while, we'll get somebody from like New Jersey who will come in and talk. And it's very interesting to hear their viewpoints from a non-agricultural area and to hear their viewpoints on ag. The key, though, is to remember how important it is because first off, those are populated areas where, with voters who don't understand ag and with lawmakers who don't understand ag. And so part of what we've always done with the National Association of Farm Broadcasting is also help bring awareness of ag issues to those lawmakers so that they can have more of an ag awareness. Now, here's where some of this disconnect, and bear with me as I get to my point here, but here's where some of this disconnect comes is that we have people who are not seeing the value of climate information connected to agriculture. And that's baffling for me how the USDA is not fighting for this information for farmers. And I know that was a really roundabout way to get to that point, but we have worked a lot to help educate lawmakers on the importance of ag. Who's educating the USDA on the importance of climate information? Apparently nobody.
I think that's actually very well said and a good point. And back at the beginning of our conversation is data, some of the stuff that has gone on in different regions of the country, including California, the data, the information, the weather trends, the soil trends, all of that is needed when making decisions on what we're going to do about the wildfires and about droughts and things that are predicted to come up. If you don't have that information, how do you look ahead? And won't it save money predicting that and learning to mitigate that now rather than, I guess, being proactive rather than being retroactive and not having any of that information and it's just going to happen and you're going to figure it out? That doesn't make sense to me either.
Right. And it just doesn't make sense. But there's another part of this as well. And this is affecting farmers around the nation, causing some even to look at that they may be losing their farms. We're talking this morning about the USDA eliminating all data on climate science, which I have to say, to me, that's a surprise move because climate science and agriculture are so tightly interwoven. But another part of this problem that we haven't really talked about yet is the programs that were eliminated with it and the programs that farmers are already participating in, that they were already in contracts. And we've talked about it before on the show, but they were already in contracts with the federal government. A lot of these contracts were reimbursement contracts where a farmer agrees to put certain things into place. They agree to buy new equipment for whatever. Then they submit their receipts and proof of following the program to the government, and the government then issues their grant money. The problem is the farmers have gone through all of their processes. They have followed their rules. They have followed the contract. They have put their programs into place. They have spent that money. They've now sent the receipts to the government, and the Trump administration is saying, no, we're not giving you that money that we promised, or that was promised, because somebody else promised it. That means the federal government is not upholding its contracts to farmers, and it's anything that was climate related for the purpose of what we're talking about today. There are other things as well, but what we're talking about today are the climate programs. So those climate programs are now not funded, and we have farmers who were relying on that money when they made their decisions and now won't be getting it.
Yeah, we did talk about that in a show, and some of these money outlays are extremely significant on how much has been spent in anticipation of getting money from some of these programs. Yeah. And not to mention that it violates several other acts, like the Freedom of Information Act. There's kind of a list here on all the things that make what they did illegal in general. But yeah, Freedom of Information Act, I lost it now. But there was a few others that it also violated doing this.
Yeah, they are violating laws by removing that information and then not allowing the public to have it. And the Freedom of Information Act is a very important piece of this as well, especially because that was information from the federal government and the public has a right to it. And you can't just delete it and make it go away.
Exactly. Exactly. So now what happens is, I guess, the question, we'll have to follow up on this lawsuit in a future conversation to see what happens here. There's a number of lawsuits that are now before the courts since the inauguration. So I
Hmm.
don't know how far down the pipeline this is, but definitely it's going to leave a lot of people. And we're talking mainly farmers. They're the ones, those in the environmental groups have brought up the lawsuit, but there's a lot of other people, a lot of other industries that are also going to be affected by this, all the affiliate industries. And I would venture to say that even some of USDA's own employees, when trying to help put together programs and administer programs, are not going to have this anymore. It's going to cause a chain of events, I think, that is going to be real difficult to maneuver.
Yeah. And I would even also say, looking at other industries or related industries that are affected, it brings to mind, Lori, the ag equipment industry. With there being such a focus on improving ag equipment to make it better for the earth, essentially, to use. Well, a lot of those guidelines follow along the climate smart ag practices, which the Trump administration is trying to do away with. And now, granted, I will say the Biden administration had such a focus on climate smart agriculture. I have to tell you, there was a point here not too long ago when I was just so sick of the words because it seemed like everything coming out of the Biden USDA was climate smart ag practices. And some of it just did not seem efficient, or some of it, I don't know, it was so much. And I understand that's not the focus of this administration, but to go back and to try to just delete it all is causing significant problems for the equipment industry that has been really shifting everything, like a lot of our car makers and things are too, to make the ag equipment more efficient, to meet consumer demand and expectations, to do better for farmers, to work with the climate smart needs for agriculture. What's going to happen to them? Now, first off, farmers are not going to be getting the government subsidies that they're used to for improving their ag equipment, which means equipment sales will probably go down. Also, there were government incentives for creating that equipment, for designing it, for engineering. Those, they're going to lose that. So they're not going to have that type of government incentive to create or engineer better equipment. So that's just one of these side industries that will also be feeling the result of this.
Yeah, for sure. Banking could be another one I could see where this would be difficult as they're making farm loans and trying to figure out what the trends are. That would be something else. I did find the other two so it does, according to the lawsuit, it does go against the Freedom of Information Act, violate it. It also violates the Administrative Procedure Act and the Paperwork Reduction Act. In addition, the laws require public disclosure of many records and policy statements. And this is what I wanted to point out. It includes provisions for public notice before making major revisions to an agency website. So that's some of the premises of this lawsuit that we are discussing here today.
That last one's really interesting considering all of the major revisions they've made, not just on climate smart things, but other things, all the DEI stuff. Yeah, I
Yeah,
can see there being a lot of lawsuits coming from that as well. That's
yeah,
big. Yeah. And again, when we're talking about the lack of government efficiency, having the government do all of these changes that are illegal, and they should know it's illegal. These are not people, mostly, are not people just pulled off the street to do government jobs. And I'm talking about high up in the administration.
yeah.
We should have administration members who understand how government works. I would venture to say some of them honestly don't, but now we're going to be tied up in courts and there's an expense involved in that. And this is going against everything that they were supposed to be doing.
Yeah, it
All these,
doesn't.
I was just going to say, all these farmers who they made big promises to, this is not the way to follow those promises.
Yeah, you made me think about this. So doesn't the Trump administration have people who are watching out? Hey, we're going to be breaking the law if we do this. We're not supposed to be doing this. Isn't there any advisory on let's be careful about how we're doing this? Because if the government is being ran by a businessman, certainly there's got to be like, we follow the laws of the land. That's what businesses do. We have rules in place for a reason.
But again, President Trump is trying to change the rules and has decided that he makes them so he can change them. And and there's my comment of the day that's going to get me in a lot of trouble. I'm just really tired of seeing how our farmers treated like this. But we've been talking this morning about removing climate smart or climate information from USDA, but we're going to shift topics a little bit because there was something else that Lorrie brought up this morning that we wanted to just touch on briefly. And this is, in fact, involves another fee from Donald Trump, President Trump. He's talking about imposing fees on Chinese shipping companies and vessels built in China, or so basically ships that were built in China versus American built ships. Just the fact that the boat itself was built in China, he wants to impose new fees on that when they come into U.S. harbors. That's what I'm understanding from this.
Yes, and that is exactly correct. This is something I don't think I've ever really reported on. So this is a new thing for me too. So as you said, any Chinese built vessels coming into US ports will be experiencing a sharp increase. And I do have some detailed numbers on that I can go over here today as far as those increases. I won't go into every little number, but it gives you an idea of the general scope of this. So if the Chinese shipping company has less than 50% of its fleet, or if not Chinese, I'm sorry, let me take that back. The shipping company, it doesn't matter who it is. If the shipping company has less than 50% of its fleet composed of Chinese built ships, it will have an increase of 25%. So the fee will be at $750,000. If it is less than 25%, but more than 1% of the fleet that is Chinese built, the fee is $500,000. And then it goes on to talk about some of the details on even what that means as far as per bushel and how that goes into those fees. So that we could see even an increase in the fees per bushel of the crops that are shipped if they are shipped on a Chinese built ship. So hopefully that's not too confusing.
It's a little bit confusing. Not how you explained it, but just the whole situation is confusing. But essentially now, if a shipping company is using ships that were made in China, then they are going to see an additional fee. But the real situation here is they are going to pass those fees on to consumers. So ultimately, again, we're going to see another price increase for our regular goods. And not just us, but I'm guessing that this is for ships that are leaving the U.S. with our products as well, which means U.S. products will cost more to consumers in other countries. And if you're looking to buy, something, I don't know, whatever we're sending out, if you're looking to buy blueberries and they're $1 a pound, which obviously blueberries are going to be more than $1 a pound. But to make it simple, if your blueberries are $1 a pound from your country versus $3 a pound from the US, which ones are you buying?
Yeah, exactly.
So
exactly.
We will come back and check on that in a couple of years and see what happened. This segment is brought to you by the Almond Board of California. Find them online at almonds.com. I'm talking today with Taylor Hillman, Senior Specialist of Industry Communications at the Almond Board. All right, Taylor, so you have some workshops coming up. Tell me about them.
Yeah, that's right, Sabrina. So my field outreach and education team at the Almond Board of California is again bringing back the regional field workshops that they've been doing the last few years. And what these were meant to be is smaller workshops, either in the field or in a classroom, really with some hands-on education, explaining some of the things that are available through our research, grower-funded research, that we can help a grower if they have more questions, if they want to know more about a certain subject. And the idea with these workshops is they are regional. So there are several throughout the state. And the idea is to be able to get to more growers. If you couldn't make it to the Almond Conference, or if you couldn't make it to one of our summits last year, this is something that's closer, more available. It's just a couple hours in the morning. So it's something that we found beneficial over the last 2 years, and we're bringing back again this year, next month.
So I know that you carefully chose the topics that'll be involved, but why are the topics important?
Yeah, that's right. This year's topic it's going to be the Pest ID workshops. And although that's a good title, it's a little misleading, because what this is going to be doing is looking at basically windrow sampling. So at the end of the season, after you shake the nuts out of the tree and they're on the ground, it's a good idea to take a look at what kind of damage you have at that point, what's known as windrow sampling, crack out some nuts, and be able to assess how your integrated management plans, IPM systems, worked that year. Not only is this a good way to give you insight into what damage you may see from the handler when they give you your damage report, but also tell you if your IPM plans are doing a good job, how efficient they are, especially in a year when you're trying something new or maybe different than you have the year prior. Doing these types of windrow sampling at the end of the season just gives you a good kind of quick picture on, did it work? How good did it work? And do I have a problem? And what is needed in the future? You can start looking at calculating out damage rates too as well. So just a lot of information you can find from this. A lot of pest control advisors are used to doing this, but it's good for both PCAs, CCAs, and growers to know this information when harvest is complete and those nuts are on the ground. It's a good time to assess your management systems.
So you said these are regional workshops. Where are they going to be held?
We try to make it to as many places as we can. We have 4 workshops coming up for this Pest ID workshop. The first being March 11th, and this will start in the North State in Orland. This will be at the Glen Success Conference Center in Orland, California. Again, that's March 11th. Then the next day, it'll be March 12th at Modesto, at the Modesto Junior College East Campus Ag Building. Everybody knows the MJC Ag Building in Modesto. That one's on March 12th. And then it'll take a week off. And then March 18th, it'll move south down to Fresno at the Fresno County Farm Bureau, again on March 18th. And then the following day, it'll conclude March 19th in Bakersfield at the UC Cooperative Extension, the Kern County Farm and Home Advisors office down in Bakersfield.
So what about any other speakers at the workshops?
Yeah, so there'll be a lot of topics covered at the workshops. Our pest management specialist at the Almond Board of California, Lauren Fan, she will be there to kick things off. She's going to go over just a general idea of windrow sampling and then kick off the agenda. She'll also talk about something very important that you can learn more here in some communications coming out from ABC and at these events, and that is making sure to report Carpophilus beetle infestations. Because it needs official reporting of these beetle populations in certain counties. There's only been about 4 counties that have official reports filed of the beetle. So she's going to talk a little bit about the importance of working with your commissioner, local ag commissioner, to report beetle infestations, and then she'll kick off with the agenda. They'll go through windrow sampling. It'll be hands-on. And this will really look at, how this can evaluate your pest management program. PCAs, several PCAs from whichever region, when these are at the regional locations, they'll discuss the different pests in almond orchards and the damage that they can cause on the kernel. They'll also discuss how to do the proper sampling and how to calculate damage rates. So a lot of information from these PCAs. And because they're from the region, it will be regional specific at these workshops, which is nice. Then they'll also talk about the damage rates. In a 30-minute set, you can pretty much crack out the right amount of nuts and calculate your rates, and then you'll know exactly where you should be when your report comes back. And then finally, we'll have some UC farm advisors or extension specialists, depending on the region, location, that will talk about the pests, talk about identification, talk about the potential damage they can have, just about the pest in general. And so a lot of information, again, not only from the Almond Board, but from trusted industry professionals that growers and PCAs are used to and familiar with throughout the season.
So is there a cost, and how can people register?
This is a free event. And like I mentioned, it basically runs from 9 to 11. This is a 2-hour event. It should allow you to have plenty of time for the rest of the day to do what you need to get done. It is online. We do ask for registration, even though it is free. It just helps us get a head count of people. You can find more at almonds.com/events. And again, reiterating, this is a free event, so take advantage of it if you're close to those regions, and you can do so by registering.
To get more information on the topics you heard today, visit AgNet West at agnetwest.com. You can also stay connected by following us on our social media at AgNet West on Facebook, Instagram, and X. And be sure to subscribe to our podcast by searching for AgNet West on your podcast app. Thank you for listening to the AgNet News Hour from AgNet West. AgNet West Radio Network, your primary choice for agriculture news.